Hey, and welcome to this episode of State of the Hack. I'm Nick Carr.
And I'm Christopher Glyer.
And we have a lot to talk about today.
Action-packed show.
Yes, a special guest from the red team side that we're pretty excited about. So, hey, man, let's get started.
Cheers.
So, let's get started talking about Fin 6. Let's jump right into it. We put out a blog post recently about that activity, where they were deploying Ryuk and Locker Gogo. But do you want to step us through, like, what happened?
I mean, the key takeaways I took from it were, there's a trend that we've been talking about now for probably the last 6 to 9 months, where we've been discussing kind of enterprise ransomware deployments to extort money from victims, and we've hit upon it in many previous ones. One of the groups that was using it was deploying TrickBot and Emotet and Empire.
Yeah,
and
we talked about that on a previous show and put out a blog post there about that activity.
And so I think the key here is we're now seeing a second or different threat actor, in this case Fin 6, using similar techniques around the same time frame. They started like July of last year, where instead of deploying point-of-sale malware and monetizing it through card reforms, et cetera, they seem to have switched to now using and deploying enterprise ransomware to extort from victims.
Yep. So it's now at least a second group that we're tracking, that we're sharing, is also deploying Ryuk.
And the key here is they're actually deploying. We've seen them deploy 2 different ransomware families, Ryuk and then Locker Goga. Locker Goga is a kind of a newer one, even just in the last month or two.
It's been in the news a lot for a lot of high-profile public breaches.
Yeah, there was a Scandinavian manufacturer, aluminum producer, that Norsk Hydro, who had their network taken out by Locker Goga ransomware.
But this is kind of cool because it's Fin 6. It's a group we've traditionally tracked conducting card data theft, making this move, versus other groups doing access as a service that are deploying ransomware and extorting. So to actually see a Fin group, to see that move, it was interesting.
Well, we haven't really seen Fin 6 do much in the point-of-sale world in a while, and kind of it has us thinking, wondering, like, why? Like, what's the reasoning behind it? If I had to speculate, obviously, can't read into their minds, but if I had to speculate, it probably has to do with a couple factors, right? Making money from point of sale. Organizations are increasingly deploying end-to-end encryption.
Yes.
So that way, even if you break into an organization that has really end-to-end encryption from the pin pad, even if you can deploy malware to the point of sale devices, you can't actually you just get garbage data. So I think the combination of more end-to-end encryption, also
you don't just have to target people that process payment data.
Right now, there's more organizations that could be potential victims. If you target a tiny, even an organization that is really tiny, you're not going to get much payment data out of them. So it's not really worth your time and effort. Whereas in this case with the enterprise ransomware capabilities, you can hit a 300-person organization and extort, easily $100,000 out of them or more, because the costs of their operations of being down or rebuilding the infrastructure from the kind of the cost-benefit side is worth it. And that's kind of the trend of what we're seeing is, many victims that we engage with are actually paying because it's cheaper and less of an outage there. So,
and maybe it's a less risky thing as well. Maybe the credit card companies and the there's a longer payoff to delay how you actually cash out card data, and a lot more traditional laws, I suppose, being broken. So
in the point of sale world, you may you may harvest the data, say weekly or monthly, from a point of sale compromise from a large victim, and then sit on it and not be able to monetize it for 6, 9, 12 months, because as soon as you start selling it, then the card brands can do common point of purchase analysis and find that, oh, hey, this particular store in this location, all the cards that went through it were having a disproportionate amount of fraud. So, shorter time to monetize, much broader set of victims, both industries and smaller sizes, and I would say probably higher return for the risk.
I mean, it must be. The nice part is we can guess why they're doing it, but the fact that they're doing it means that it must be successful. There must be a risk reward there. It must be a better decision for them now to have made that pivot. We can guess as to why else and some of the other motivations, but they've made that change. That's actually a part of what made it challenging and confusing at first to be Fin 6. That was unexpected behavior from them. What was pretty neat about the blog, and it was written by several of our managed defense analysts, which is cool to see those guys doing that 24/7 monitoring, and get to start talking about some of these stories. There was that the Overruled blog as well that came out previously that we talked about was really neat, stopping them from deploying Shamoon. And this is another time where the managed defense guys can come out and say, like, we stopped these guys before they deployed Locker Goga. But I guess just the way it flowed was really cool behind the scenes. Like, in the morning, we identified new adversary infrastructure that was stood up. We were already actually looking into the infrastructure.
Like proactive identifying the C2 infrastructure before it's even used against the victim.
Yes, and it was being analyzed. Two of our guys on our team that really lead the charge of that effort are Andrew Thompson, who's been on the show before, and Aaron Stevens. And they were taking a look at it, and we have an ability to kind of see multiple people are working on the same thing, and they saw that it was being worked at managed defense. So it was kind of cool to see all that come together and be able to so quickly make decisions and know that it was Fin 6 and then know this other part that was different about it. So
yeah, one of the things that you may not be aware of, but in the Fin 6, so it's one threat actor, but using multiple pieces of malware to accomplish the same task. In this case, ransomware and extorting money. On the back end, there are actually whole teams of people who are kind of building ransomware as a service and then making that available in underground forums, right? So, I saw one of them, it was like advertising where you actually pay not for infecting systems, you pay actually on the decryption side. So if you can actually get the victim to pay up, you pay like $400 a system out of your own pocket as to the intermediary. You get your encryption keys and you go back and give it to the victim to decrypt. So, it makes sense. Like, if you can scale your team and resources without having to build custom malware, it also makes you more adept at kind of picking up the latest and greatest or changing up what you're doing without having to put in a lot of work, because you can just pick up a new framework that somebody built.
Sweet. So I want to let you know, too, I probably should let you know up front, we're going to talk about a bunch of other things. We're going to talk about some recent supply chain compromises in the news. The Triton attackers are back and busy, and we have a little bit to share there. Then we're going to have our Red Team guest going to come talk on about a few of their recent case studies and they've been really busy dropping a bunch of new tools and blogs and stuff like that. So I want to get into that stuff. So I mentioned the supply chain compromise that was discovered and reported on by Kaspersky.
Yep.
So we call it day job. They call
You call the malware day job.
Yeah, they called it Operation Shadowhammer, right?
Yep.
So that one was pretty interesting.
Yeah, if you're not familiar, an organization that makes computers, ASUS, was compromised, and then the attacker used their infrastructure to sign new malware, and then use the existing updater to basically deploy a malicious update, which had a piece of their or some malicious behavior included in it.
Yeah, and the payload was specifically restricted. There's a lot that's interesting there, so definitely check it out. If this is the first you're hearing about it, go check it out. But there was some really interesting artifacts there and some interesting things where it was highly controlled. So supply chain compromises in general are obviously super interesting to us, and it makes sense for them to be combined with some guardrails or other tighter targeting. And in this case...
Well, and they haven't always. Like, if you look at the CCleaner compromise and some of the previous ones from a year or two ago, it was really broadly distributed, and this one seemed to be a lot more
and the
focused and
second stage for some of those have been gated for particular organizations, but this was all kind of built in. And a lot of people, including us, we focused on some of the MAC addresses that it was specifically looking for.
It was hard-coded into the binary itself, saying, I'm not going to execute unless this is the MAC address of the system I'm running on.
Yes, not just like the vendor OU portion, like the full MAC address.
Right.
So that was actually the source of a little bit of confusion with some of our customers, because we actually did have a customer, a system that was targeted as a part of that, the specific, user's MAC address. I don't think we can get into that too much, but one more broadly, some of those MAC addresses included, VMware systems and like MAC addresses that we would expect a lot of people had, and it did not do a whole lot of tight filtering. So observed some confusion, I think, with people around.
Having the MAC address is a necessary but not sufficient condition.
Yes.
For having the second stage deployed.
Yep.
Right. So just because you have 50 systems in your network with the same, especially the VMware MAC address, doesn't mean those got the malicious update.
Yep.
You probably want to check those and do a little deeper analysis, but it's one does not equal the other.
Exactly. And the other piece that was kind of cool there is everyone was ripping it apart. again, a lot of really neat stuff. But some of the build path stuff, some of the PDBs from the files that gave you some insight into where the files were built, those were interesting pivots to discover other files, other things about that attacker. I think in that case it was the D drive, C++, and it was like ASUS shellcode. It was like pretty explicit, but there are some other things to pivot from and discover there. Of course, the quality of that overlap and connection has to do with the quality of that data that you're pivoting on. But it was a pretty interesting exercise to go back again and go from there.
And so for those of you not familiar, there's a string when you compile a binary that pulls in like what the full path is to the file on disk of the system where it was compiled. So now you can, as a bad guy, you can strip that out if you want, but that's an extra step that you have to take, and you have to be aware of, how people may use it.
It is a red team episode, so I know we've talked previously about something interesting about Windows binaries that you let me know about.
Yeah.
Want to share that with people?
So you may not realize this, but like a legitimate Windows binary won't have a full path, but will still reference the PDB, and it'll reference the same PDB by file name. So if you go look at, like, say, csrss.exe, if it's a legitimate Windows file, it'll have the PDB of csrss.pdb, right? Yeah. So if you're on the red team side wanting to emulate it, and you're trying to do things
all right. Okay, good, fair enough. But it's interesting because that's just an artifact that is what it is, and you can use that if you maybe don't have the ability to check signed binaries in the Windows directory. Maybe you're looking for matches. Like, it depends on your tech, and just understanding those forensic artifacts is key. So that's about what I wanted to chat on that. Maybe we could pivot over and talk about the blog we just recently dropped. We spoke about it at Kaspersky SAS. Our critical infrastructure team, Steve Miller and everyone, put out a blog post about, we kind of let people know we're working another intrusion from the
threat actor behind Triton. So, it's not necessarily...
So we used that opportunity to walk through and describe what we hadn't provided before, which is how the Triton attacker operated, like how they actually went about compromising the network to deliver that down into those critical networks,
including like TTPs, hashes, file names, and a bunch of other ideas on how critical infrastructure providers could take the information we've provided and kind of hunt through their own environment using different techniques. So the idea there is to try and share as much as we can with the community, so they can kind of go find other examples, because we now have 2 times we've seen at least the threat actor behind who deployed Triton.
Right.
I think that's notable.
Yeah, so, and we tried, in this particular case, again, our Intel team's been doing a little bit more of this, mapping different things to MITRE ATT&CK in that particular post. And so that was kind of interesting, too, because for some of the techniques, we didn't map them to attack. And that was
deliberate, right?
Deliberately, because I think in some of the cases, those aren't reflected yet, of course, by the nature of sharing those out and continuing to work with the teams. We'll keep moving that forward, I suppose. And I don't know if there's any of the hunting techniques that particularly jumped out at you as interesting.
Yeah, I mean, they're all. I think some are easier to implement than others. Like one of them was looking for image file execution options. So there's the registry key setting on Windows where called image file execution options, where you can basically attach a debugger to when any file executes. And so typically how we see this used, if we see it used maliciously, there's a technique where you can, once you gain access to a system and have administrative privileges, if you want to get back into the system later, you may replace one of the accessibility features. So, magnify.exe or sticky keys, so sethc.exe. And so as a bad guy, what I can do is I can overwrite sethc.exe and then disconnect from the system. And then if I RDP into it, hit the shift key 5 times, then I get a command prompt that pops up running a system. So it's especially good for if you get evicted from a victim network as a way that means to get back and immediately escalate your privileges. Yep. Now there are many different security tools that can look for the replacement of magnify.exe or sethc with command or PowerShell or Explorer or a couple of other common Windows utilities that we've seen. And so the image file execution options registry key setting a debugger is kind of it's a unique way of accomplishing the same thing. So instead of overwriting command.exe, you say, whenever I see command.exe get executed, or sethd.exe get executed, run command.exe. And so then you still accomplish the same outcome.
Right.
Now, in this case, what's much less likely to see is somebody actually then launching their malware using that registry key, because it's you're reliant on some other file executing, which maybe you pick one that's super common, or maybe you pick one that runs fairly irregularly.
Yeah, so I mean, it's interesting to highlight the bigger takeaway for me, and it's something we've been talking about for a little while, was just the nature of these client-side intrusions that eventually get down into the ICS network, but the majority of them are coming from this space. And so a lot of those techniques, like that one you mentioned there, I remember coming to Mandiant 5 years ago, and people were looking for it, and probably looking for it for a while before that. But seeing people use it still, it's a lot of traditional techniques on the enterprise network that were used, that we highlighted, or at least a lot of detection opportunities for to retain command and control down into that network. It was still routed through the enterprise.
Well, and there's a lot of proxy malware. Obviously, you can imagine if you need to get down deep in a network, you're going to have to proxy, chain, and tunnel lots of things. So you saw lots of usage of legitimate utilities like P-Link, which is a PuTTY-based or a tool within the PuTTY suite, I guess you could say, that allows you to do kind of a poor man's reverse shell that's encrypted. It's SSH traffic, so depending on what port you use, it may stick out like a sore thumb, and what tools you have. Say you shoot SSH data over port 443, that's more likely to get caught than actually tunneling out of a network over 22. But then there are also a bunch of like SSH-based either tunnelers or backdoors as well. That was a pretty core component of this particular threat actor's toolkit.
So we provided all those hunting style techniques, and attack mapping were relevant in the main blog post. And then just don't sleep on that appendix. It has the most number of advanced practices team members' Twitter handles in it. I think we just included a couple of rules and had some fun with providing people some hunting-based Yara rules and different things, different resources from the company.
And some may be super
people.
Noisy, right?
Yep.
I mean, I think the way that
Depends on your environment.
described it depends on your environment, but also depends on your tolerance, right? Like the idea is how do I get a collection of interesting things to then further mine through? And some have a really broad aperture, and some are much more narrow.
Yep, exactly. So I think at this time we're going to bring on our special guest. Come on in. Hey, welcome.
Hey. Thanks for having me.
Who are you?
Alyssa Rahman, Red
Cheers.
Teamer.
From the Red Team, our first Red Team guest, I think, except for maybe some special guests we've had on. The first internal Red Teamer.
Debo counts as a Red Teamer.
That's true.
Yeah.
That is true. Debo is on the second episode and is constantly trolled for being sort of a Red Teamer. Making a lot of work for Blue Team, maybe.
Right.
So we typically, every time everyone's on, as you know, we kind of talk a little bit about how you got into the industry and then into here. Would you mind just giving us some background?
Yeah. So I got a bachelor degree in computer science, and I focused on security kind of the whole way through. So I did a lot of work with our security club, a lot of projects, and participated in the CCDC, so it's a cyber defense competition. Yeah. But actually, all of my internships and projects were more on the incident response blue team side of things. So I kind of figured that I was going to go into blue teaming work. But then senior year, I got an opportunity to work here on Red Team, and I thought,
And give it a shot.
get well-rounded, try some new things, and it's very fun. So here I am, like 2 years later.
We have these, so we work in the same, well, all of us work in the same office, and we have like every week we get together, we have like lunch together, and people tell these little war stories sessions. And that's kind of cool because we actually get the blue team and the red team side together.
Right.
And I have to say, like, as much as I like chasing around, targeted attackers, hearing the physical pen test stories are some of my
pretty
favorite.
fun.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah.
Those are some of the most. You guys can come up with some of the most wicked ideas and actually implement them. And so we wrote in M-Trends this year. We wrote a pretty long blog post, or a long section of M-Trends. We've carved that out and made it its own blog post. And so Alyssa was one of the primary authors of that. So
What's the name of that again, so people can find it?
Finding weaknesses before the attackers do.
Yes. So that's now up on the blog post, and I think I said, hopefully no one gets mad at me about this, but like, if we had presented that and not revealed it was you guys till the end, it would be one of the most interesting cases. Obviously, we had the insight to your side of it,
Right.
but it was really just cool to see all of the different techniques, all the multiple bypasses. I mean, there's 2 different ways across the engagements covered there where multi-factor is bypassed, and just a bunch of. I appreciated the insight into like the creativity and the I don't know, problem solving that occurs post compromise.
Yeah, I think that's one of the cool things about the way at least Mandiant does red team assessments, but it's very much a focus on exploiting misconfigurations. So part of the way we test out the blue team's ability to detect and respond to malicious attackers is to try to blend into their environment as much as possible. So I think it's a cool case study just because we didn't use any exploits. I mean, there are outdated systems, sure, in the environment, but we just kind of interacted with applications like a normal user, a normal administrator would, and it let us sneak through and get to the path of least resistance to all of our objectives pretty quickly.
And eventually showing in the one of the portions highlighted, you know, one of your, I guess what were your goals? Was to target a financial application as well as actually target an ATM and show you could obtain access.
Yeah. So this article is actually co-written by myself and Curtis Antolik, who's one of our consultants out of the Northeast. But basically how we run these assessments is whenever we're setting things up with the client, we want to make them as objectives-based and realistic as possible. Because, you know, you guys were talking about, you can tell a lot about an attacker by what they're motivated and what they're targeted on hitting. So getting domain administrator, getting full, you know, access and control over a company's network is nice, but real attackers are going to be targeting PCI data or access to the ATM network, that sort of thing. So before we start any of the engagements, we sit down with the clients and we ask them, like, what are your crown jewels? What are the things that would be the absolute worst if you had to admit that you got breached?
Are people pretty good at finding that? Because on the IR side, sometimes when you respond, it's like, what's super important to your business, and that matters like based on who you're talking to.
They can tell you the what, but not necessarily with the where of like
where it is.
It's like, well, I can tell you where some of it is, but not necessarily where all of it is. So.
They rarely know where all of their data is. We help them with that. We're pretty good at asset discovery, I would say, in a really mean way. But yeah, they typically will have a list of, I think for companies in general, PII, so any personal information for their employees or their customers. PCI data, health data, and then if they're the kind of organization that's like this case study was about financial services companies, they were a lot more concerned with access to their wire transfers and databases and everything like that.
So I thought one of the more interesting points in the blog was actually how it got started, right? So instead of sending a phishing email, you guys use social engineering. Do you want to walk through a little bit of both as to the why and also like what do you do immediately post social engineering?
So we have a handful of kind of go-tos for how we get initial access. And email and phone-based phishing are pretty much solid ways in 90% of the time, maybe more. And that's also partially just because that's what real attackers are using. So we try to emulate that as much as possible. I really enjoy phone-based social engineering for a few reasons. I think one, it's just something that traditionally, people have gotten pretty used to. Don't open the Nigerian Prince emails. They understand that phishing emails are bad, and it's part of their security awareness training. I think a gap that comes up a lot is people might tell you that you'll get a phishing call over the phone, especially with all the spammers that call everybody these days. But people aren't really trained on how to tell if it's real or not. So if I'm pretending to be your IT security team and I have my phone number spoofed as your help desk, they're typically not given the tools that they need to figure out if that's real or not.
Right. Well, and your IT security team probably doesn't have like their VoIP phone records ported into your log management tools and other things would even be able to identify something like that.
Simply identifying that multiple people are even being called within the organization is not something centrally collected and analyzed.
Yeah, I'm only aware of one investigation in my almost 10 years here now where we've even ever seen phone-based social engineering or some kind of social engineering used in investigation, and it was hyper targeted. The person actually befriended somebody and then contacted them afterwards by the phone. But it's certainly a very viable avenue, and
It's one of those that we know is going on a lot more. It's
Yeah.
underreported because it's outside of our visibility, typically.
Well, and it's
outside
hard
of
to, it's also
Fin
hard,
7,
it's
where
also
we've
hard
talked
to
about that.
prove, right? Like, you know, the evidence from a defender's perspective is you'll just see somebody like log into some, you know, either RDP or some port, like that could be one way they get in, but you don't necessarily, okay, well, they logged in, but how? Like, and it's really hard to kind of chase the put the pieces together to be like, oh, okay, like you just have this kind of bad thing happen.
Yeah, if you like data and people doing incident response and forensics like hard data, there's like no data. I remember for Fin 7 stuff, it was like, we almost went to like bomb threat checklist mode. Like, what kind of accent did the person have? And someone said Nigerian, and some said like British, and you're like, oh, like, no, none of that's necessarily right. But, you know, you're just relying on a person recounting something. So
Yeah, I was going to say that's kind of, that's the other main reason we like it so much is from a defender perspective, there's very few artifacts that are left over. But then also, a lot of times you can do recon ahead of time and figure out what kind of firewalls and proxies and filters the customer might have in place, but you don't necessarily know what payloads are going to work until you start running them. So I enjoy it because it lets me pretty rapidly prototype, because I can just I can call and have 3 payloads ready to go.
Oh, wait, hold on one sec. Try this one now, right?
It's happened. I usually will have up to 2 phone calls per person and try up to like 2 or 3 payloads each call, and they'll click on everything. I think it's, you build this rapport with someone like, oh man, I don't know, they told me they tested this, the IT guys, what can you do? Like, you can build up a pretty good relationship, and people are just like, it makes sense why they would kind of follow on and keep clicking on things, but it's really helpful because a lot of times they'll even go so far as to read me the errors that they're getting. So
amazing.
They'll be running a payload and it'll fail, and they'll be like, well, no, it looks like it's just the browser's blocking, and I'm like, cool, I have a backup domain. And so then once we figure out what works, we can scale it more and send it through emails, because we know that
Right.
IT team won't see it.
it's funny, at the most basic level, I talked about Fin 7 doing this initially, which was just like, hey, did you get my email? And it's amazing because, like, that's really basic, but that's like,
It works.
Was someone's email security thing blocking this? Pretty nice way to figure it out, and people will always be willing to run that thing down. So, like, I do think it's funny, too, like, even when there's social engineering training for organizations, I think you've mentioned recently there's another one where you were being walked through what they had been trained on.
We had called the same person a couple of times, and it was kind of towards the end of testing, so we knew the IT team had caught on, but we were just finishing out a few more tests, and we had
You were
called,
having fun.
We were
That's what it sounds like to me.
we were trying to test a couple extra payloads to make sure we knew what ran through their proxies, but we had called this one person back, and it was like the second or third time that week, pretending to be IT, and she answers the phone.
Let's call her Gladys.
Gladys works. But she answers the phone, and she's like, I'm so glad you called. I'm really worried. I'm very careful, but I think I got an email phish. And the consultant that was doing the social engineering was like, oh, okay, well, why don't you read me the email? I'm looking at your computer. And she reads it out, and it's this whole long, it was a very good email from their IT security team, warning everyone that people were trying email and phone-based social engineering, telling them what it was. They might
How to spot signs for it. Yeah,
they might try to get you to click on a link or type in your password, run something, and she reads the whole thing, and she's like, well, you just have to be so silly to run something like that. I don't understand how people fall for this. And our consultant felt so bad. He was like, they're very convincing. Don't feel bad if you find out later. Like, we're really sorry. And she's like, anyway, honey, it's fine. So what link did you need me to go to? I'll log in right now and run the payload for you.
Perfect.
And we're like, oh no. So it was good on the IT security team, but I think it's at some point, like I said, you build up that rapport with people, and it's kind of hard to beat that.
Yeah.
Like I said, very mean.
Right.
We come up with creative.
Yeah, how do you feel after all this? Come on.
Take a little shower, like.
Yeah, a little bit. Sometimes you feel bad about it, but I will say, especially with the number of spam calls that people get these days, like you have family members and friends who get targeted, and people try to con them out of their own money. Mm-hmm. So I look at red teaming as a very creative, if not kind of mean, demonstration, or it's a much more impactful way to understand the risk of something when you've had it happen to you or you've heard it. Yeah. So I think it's mean, but the stories get told a lot around the office, and then people think twice, and they end up with a lot more information on how to not actually get conned or social engineered in their day-to-day life. That's how I sleep at night, at least.
I'm in the office with you guys and hearing you make your calls, and then I'll get a phone call from someone in the DC area that's like, hey, I'm a security investigator for this person. We'll go through the background. I'm like, are you, though? And it's a whole thing. It's not a very pleasant
I would say there's a healthy paranoia when I see people I don't know walking around the office, because you just watch them and you're like, that's how I would do it if I was breaking in.
Yes. And come on, full disclosure, last week you guys ran down someone who was a new employee. You're like, who are you? It's good, though.
Yeah, I mean, they didn't have their badge yet. It's not my fault.
They'll learn it one way or another. So I'm trying to think. There was like multiple, again, 2FA bypasses discussed.
Yeah.
There's just some really cool stuff if people
Not
haven't
like
checked
exploits,
that out.
but creative ways of getting around something that used multi-factor to protect it. Right?
Was there anything else that from you and Curtis's blog that you wanted to share that was kind of like
stood out,
novel or fun?
I really enjoyed, so Curtis actually did this one, but so as part of the case study, basically we social engineered, we called people and got them to log in and type in their password, but we didn't have them run any payloads. So
that's to like an OWA.
Yeah, it was like a fake Outlook portal or something, and so they were. We had to figure out a way to go from just having their password and their credentials to actually logging into their network. And so Curtis found a single factor bring your own device portal, but they weren't allowed to enroll anything. So they actually ended up downloading the mobile device management Android app, logging in with their credentials because that was single factor, and they got an IP on the network. So then they just tethered their laptop and were
slowest network connection ever.
Yes, slowest network connection ever for sure. But it's really creative because it's a good example of, we tell people, if you have Citrix or anything, you need to protect it with
multi-factor, all the things. Right?
Multi-factor, all the things, and then people just have those one or two gaps. They're like, that's okay. Fine, yeah. Right. But it was
phone tethering is pretty solid. I like it a lot.
Yeah, I thought that was a really clever one.
Nice. Yeah, the post is awesome. So I'm so happy it's just up on the blog, and we'll link to it for people to check it out.
So one of the things we started the discussion about on the Fin 6 side was actually about more of some of our new capabilities in the last 6-9 months, more proactively using a bunch of tools to look for new infrastructure. How does that impact your
There seems to be a lot of red team interest over the last couple of months too.
It seems like a newer thing that there wasn't much discussion around this maybe even a year ago.
Yeah, on both sides.
What considerations do you guys have, or what's changed for you guys even in the last year?
Yeah, I would say, I think in general, as far as the trends you're speaking of, it seems like OPSEC for red team infrastructure is something that's always been kind of a best practices. So I think
best practice, but nobody did.
Right. It's one of those things where it's the best thing to do, and if you're running one of the scripts you have for infrastructure setup, or you have the time to get through all the steps, you're going to set up your infrastructure well. At least that's if you're in a company like Mandiant has methodologies for how we set up everything. But I think recently there's been an increased look from defenders, like
maybe increased awareness that the defenders are looking and talking about that sort of thing.
Yeah, and I think that's put a little bit more of I would say a sense of urgency on making sure you're actually looking at it.
Right.
Because, like I said, there's always this healthy paranoia, I think, that security gives you in general, but red teaming specifically. Because
so, what's your concern when you're standing up infrastructure? What are you thinking about?
So when we're setting up infrastructure for a red team versus a pen test, so with pen tests you might be just worried about finding vulnerabilities in the network, but with red teams, you are really wanting to test out the customer's defense and their detection and their ability to respond. And one of the things that we try not to do is immediately look like a pen tester or a red team. Because if they can come in and see this is just something from Mandiant, it's going to change not only how they respond to the initial incident, but also how they start reviewing their logs and trying to hunt us down. And, good blue teams are going to run through the whole same process anyway, but we don't want to give them the opportunity to cheat themselves out of a good learning opportunity. So we try as much as possible to not kind of tip off who we are. But then personally, just my paranoia of I don't want to disclose who clients are, so I don't want them to be able to track it back to me or Mandiant, because I have the pride of not wanting to set up sloppy infrastructure personally. And then I also I don't reuse anything between engagements, because I think, especially with the increased hunting that people are doing, the communities on Twitter and people hunting through virus total, if someone finds one payload targeting one client and is able to trace it to another customer that's also being targeted, and eventually they're able to tie it back to Mandiant, that's starting to leak information. So, I think
in some ways, you guys might care in those scenarios about OPSEC more than, not everyone, but maybe a good subset of attackers. And like, one of the interesting things for me, and we've had this talk a lot, and Andrew Thompson, who's been on the show, we've talked about it. Like, we understand there's varying OPSEC applied, right? Like the pen test thing. We don't want to create unnecessary work for just like starting an exercise. But what's crazy is what we observe is, for uninvited, unwelcome compromises, the infrastructure looks very similar. So it's hard, as we're observing it, the infrastructure stood up.
Right.
We just treat it all the same, right? Like if we see it,
we're
going to slam it down.
It's a C2 server of this backdoor type, and you may or may not know who is using it.
And we're trying to feed that directly into the products and stop stuff. And it's actually kind of nuanced and a little bit interesting for the case of a pen test versus a red team, because like we don't want to prevent our customers from enjoying a pen test that's targeted and authorized, but we actually don't know the difference. And because we're correcting for the broader issue, sometimes some of that is rolled up. So
you almost need to overcorrect.
maybe as a result, we're forcing people to put more work into infrastructure stand up. But like you said, it's automated and templated. And
it should be. Yeah. Hopefully it is.
I feel like it's like eating your vegetables. Everybody, like, nobody likes doing it. Everybody knows you should do it. It's good for you, but you just don't want to, right?
When you always have the one case where your scripts break and you have to run back through things manually, so people get in their rhythms, which I think is funny, because I sit with a lot of our incident responders, and I talk to you guys a lot, but it's funny hearing about the weird typos or the tiny OPSEC fails that come up in investigations, because you guys are seeing it as, oh, why did they make this mistake, and I'm seeing it as, yeah, sometimes you just have typos. Sometimes things don't work. You copy paste the wrong command, and it's kind of funny seeing that real attackers have the same
problem. The struggle is real.
Infrastructure's hard.
Well, especially when you have lots of it stood up at lots of different victims at the same time, and
that's the differentiator too. Like I think maybe I'm softening. Maybe I've been too hard sometimes. Maybe it's just because we got a red teamer here. Yeah. I think before we've talked about how like nation states look more like red teams. The red teams look like nation states. I've said that. Not the most popular take, but it's something I said. And but one of those examples is like, as it relates to infrastructure, like nation states are typically compromising infrastructure. Those guys, suspected North Koreans, like anyone of any scale, like they will compromise legit infrastructure, and that seems like a dividing line between the activity, just because it's
almost because rules of engagement. Like as a red team, you can't do that, right? Like you have to operate within legal terms and conditions, and all those things. So,
but the nice thing is, on the blue team side, that probably adds in some differentiators for how you look at that activity, unless you have a red team that's maybe not operating by those rules, which is kind of fun too. But either way, you can stop it, right? But
it's definitely a challenge. I think there are some perks to both sides. I think some advantages to both sides of being a legitimate actor versus not. It's also very true that any red team tools that are public are probably going to end up getting used by attackers at some point. That's just
and they do
free labor, so I don't blame them at all.
That's what makes Debo fall into the red team category.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. Used his tool on pretty much all my engagements.
So we released this week. Actually, this last week we released a new VM. Commando VM. Do you want to talk a little bit about kind of what was the genesis of that, and what's the goal or intent of being able to releasing that, and what we hope other red teams to be able to get out of it?
Yeah. So one of our consultants, Jake Barteau, he made basically a script that automates installing and configuring a just plain Windows virtual machine, or I guess your host if you're bold. But it installs a bunch of tools and common things that we use for all kinds of assessments. So primarily a red team tool, but he's as he's iterating and adding on more stuff, he's wanting to add in things for helping blue teamers use the red team tools that are included in the VM to test out detections.
Like practice and
Right.
It's deployed in the same way too. For defenders, if you haven't tried it, it's deployed in the same way as like a Flare VM from our Flare team. So they worked with Flare actually to be like,
Yeah.
What do you do?
let's make this quick and lightweight for installing this and auto setting everything up with these scripts. Has some pretty sweet backgrounds too.
It's super. Honestly, my favorite part. I mean, it's a great VM, and I use it for a ton of stuff now. But
The little Mega Man background, or the
they have all different colors. It's
or
perfect.
Mega Man inspired, I guess you could say.
Yeah. The little commando ninja guy and girls. There's both. But I've gotten to the point where I set that as my Kali background too.
Awesome. Yeah, nice.
You got it. It looks like a little hacker.
Right.
It's exciting. But yeah, it's super. It's not a Kali replacement so much as you have to know your tools. There's
Like a compliment.
Right. And so I end up using both of them on pretty much every engagement I'm on, because there's some things that if you're testing out a payload, you just test it and then revert your snapshot and you're good to go. Or I develop payloads in virtual machines to make sure everything's clean.
Sometimes you need an actual Windows environment to really.
So I think that's kind of the difference in it. The reason it's not a Kali replacement is it's intended. It's not just Kali tools ported to Windows. It's all of the Windows specific things that you end up needing on random engagements. Yeah. So they're still working on it, and if you have any tools that you guys think are missing, open up GitHub issues. But
Yeah, they've been responding and moving along.
And adding them in, yeah.
they're wanting to add in more, I think, mobile and wireless support too. So it's an awesome tool, and
Sweet.
the backgrounds are amazing.
And then we had a really cool presentation recently on ADFS.
Yeah.
Eventually, maybe we'll have Doug Beanstalk on. I feel like we've talked about him on like 3 episodes. Sup, Doug?
Yeah.
But Doug and Austin Baker did a presentation at Troopers, and you guys did a code release. And I feel like I don't think we had a blog for it, so I just wanted to maybe highlight that a little bit.
There's no blog release for it, but the talk is online. Highly recommend it. I think Doug tweeted out a link to it, and FireEye probably retweeted it at some point. But ADFS is Active Directory Federated Services, which is essentially Microsoft's implementation of single sign-on. So it's the way that you can configure. So your users with Active Directory accounts can sign into all of the cloud services that your company sets up. Whether that's Office 365 or Slack or whatever other services as you're migrating to the cloud, the ADFS server will take in their login, validate it, and then sign a SAML token and pass it on to your cloud services. So pretty much all these cloud services providers have ADFS connectors in, but as organizations move more towards the cloud, I think it's kind of a really good example of why, I mentioned earlier, getting domain administrator is really nice, but there are a lot more objectives that you can go after that require additional steps. So with this attack specifically, you actually have to have the ADFS service account to run it and be running on the ADFS server. So just having domain administrator isn't enough, but the premise of the attack is that it will use the ADFS account and server and export the signing certificate for those SAML tokens. And then you can pull it offline, and they have a script and some templates set up, but you can just forge tokens for arbitrary users. So since you have that certificate, as far as those cloud services are concerned, it's completely valid, and you can just kind of tell them, like, I'm Nick Carr.
Right.
And
it's kind of like a Kerberos golden ticket, but for cloud services, right?
Exactly. And that's the thing is I think the certificates by default last for a year. And you guys could probably speak to this better than I could, but I'm pretty sure it's not part of organizations' routine hunting or mitigation.
No, I think it's a newer.
Yeah.
It's still very nascent in terms of most organizations' even visibility or understanding.
Yeah, I think the blue team response to watching Austin and Doug's talk was a little bit like, oh, okay. Like, oh boy.
Yep.
Yeah. I don't know that. I've stepped away from the IR side a little bit, so I can't speak to like responding to it. But it seems like it's kind of fun too. It's like a whole new area, and people love solving problems on the blue side. So It's pretty cool. So wait,
Yeah.
so we released a toolkit on GitHub as well?
Yes, yeah, it's on the FireEye GitHub, and it's ADFS dump is it's .NET assembly, so you can run it through whatever your malware of choice is. But you run it on the ADFS server under that service account. It'll export all the things you need, and then you can run it with a Python 3 script that's ADFS spoof. And then it'll just generate arbitrary tokens for you. So from there, you just copy that into your browser, and you're good to go.
You're off to the races.
Yeah.
Cool. Well, it was great interviewing you, and
Nice.
thanks so much for
Appreciate it.
joining us.
Thanks for joining.
Cheers, and we'll see you next time.
See ya.